There was a week each December when the house began to change. Not all at once, and not in dramatic ways, but slowly as familiar objects returned to their places. A box came down from a shelf. A strand of lights was tested at the kitchen table. The smell of pine or warm plastic settled into the air. These were not grand traditions. They were ordinary, repeated without announcement, and shared by millions of families who never thought to call them special. Now, they live mostly in memory, recalled in quiet detail by those who were there. The tree did not arrive perfectly shaped. It came tied with rough twine, needles already loosening, sap clinging to the trunk. It rested in a metal stand that needed tightening more than once. Someone lay on the floor to adjust it while another held it upright. The room carried the sharp scent of pine for days. Before decorations, the lights were tested. Large bulbs in red, blue, green, and amber were screwed in one by one. If a single bulb failed, the whole strand went dark. The search for the loose connection became part of the ritual. When they finally lit, they glowed warmly, almost heavily, casting color onto the walls. Tinsel was applied carefully. Not thrown in handfuls, but laid strand by strand across each branch. It caught the light and trembled when someone walked past. Glass ornaments followed. Some were thin and hollow, painted in faded metallic shades. A few had lost their silvering inside, leaving clear patches like small windows. Nothing matched. That was never the point. Each piece had a place remembered from the year before. Children were given the lower branches. The fragile ones stayed higher, out of reach. When the tree was finished, the room felt rearranged. Furniture shifted to make space. The television angled slightly toward it. At night, only the tree lights were left on. The rest of the house went dark. The colors reflected softly in the windows, doubling the tree against the black glass. For a few weeks, it stood there quietly, absorbing conversation, wrapping paper, and the low murmur of winter evenings. Then, just as quietly, it was taken down. Needles were swept. Ornaments wrapped again in tissue. The box returned to the shelf, waiting without ceremony for another December. The Christmas cards began arriving in early December, sometimes the day after Thanksgiving. They came in steady clusters, held together by a rubber band from the mailbox. The envelopes were thick, many addressed in careful cursive. Return addresses were written by hand, not printed. Some included a short letter folded inside, a single page describing the year in modest detail. The cards themselves followed familiar themes. Snow-covered churches, red barns against white fields, angels with pale faces and gold halos. Glitter clung to fingertips after opening them. Inside, messages were brief. Thinking of you this season. Peace and joy. Names were signed individually, each family member listed in blue or black ink. They were displayed as they arrived. Some were tucked along the edge of the mantel. Others were taped to door frames or arranged across a sideboard. By mid-December, they formed a quiet collage of faces, handwriting, and postage stamps from different towns and states. There was no urgency in reading them. They were opened at the kitchen table, sometimes after dinner, sometimes late in the evening. The act felt deliberate. A paper knife might be used. The envelope was slit cleanly along the top. Children examined the stamps. Parents recognized the handwriting before reading the name. Certain cards were expected each year. If one did not come, it was noticed. After the holiday, the cards were taken down carefully. A few were saved in drawers. Most were placed in a stack and set aside. Yet for those weeks in December, they stood as small confirmations of connection, proof that someone, somewhere, had paused long enough to write and send a greeting across the winter miles. On one evening each December, the household gathered around a single television program. The date was known in advance. It appeared in the newspaper listings, circled in pen. There were no reminders beyond that. If you missed it, there was no second chance. The television itself was heavy and often housed in a wooden cabinet. The screen curved slightly at the corners. Rabbit ear antennas stood on top, adjusted carefully for clearer reception. Sometimes a sheet of aluminum foil was wrapped around the tips to improve the signal. When the program began, conversation lowered. The familiar opening music signaled that this was the moment. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. Parents remained on the sofa, arms folded or resting along the back cushion. The room lights were dimmed, though not fully off. Commercial breaks were part of the rhythm. Advertisements for toys, department stores, and winter clothing blended into the evening. No one left the room for long. The program would resume without warning. Certain scenes carried quiet weight. A final song. A snowfall drawn in simple animation. A closing line that lingered. Even those who had seen it many times watched again without impatience. When it ended, the screen faded to black before returning to regular programming. The moment passed quickly. Someone rose to turn off the set. The antennas were nudged back into place. There was no discussion about rewatching. It would come again next year, at the same hour, announced in the same small square of newsprint. Until then, the memory of that shared hour remained folded into the season, recalled in fragments of dialogue and the soft glow of the television in a darkened room. Outdoor decorations were simple and often installed in a single afternoon. A string of colored lights traced the edge of the roofline or framed the front door. The bulbs were larger than those used today, spaced evenly along a thick green cord. Extension cords stretched across porches and along frozen ground, connected carefully to a single outlet. Some houses displayed lighted plastic figures. A glowing Santa stood near the steps. A small choir of carolers, molded in translucent material, shone softly from within. The figures were hollow and lightweight, anchored by a brick or stake to keep them steady in the wind. Inflatables were not yet common. Movement came instead from mechanical pieces. A simple motor turned a plastic star or rotated a small display in the front window. In some yards, a wooden nativity scene was arranged beneath a spotlight, figures painted by hand and stored in the garage the rest of the year. The installation process involved ladders and cold fingers. Neighbors sometimes paused to comment or offer brief assistance. There was no competition, only a quiet acknowledgement that the season had begun. At night, the neighborhood changed. Porches glowed in red and green. Living room windows revealed decorated trees inside. The air carried the faint smell of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. No timers controlled the lights. Someone stepped outside each evening to plug them in, and later to unplug them before bed. The act was routine, almost unnoticed. Yet those small gestures, climbing the steps, bending toward the outlet, watching the lights flicker on, marked the passage of December nights in a way that felt steady and familiar. The Christmas catalogs arrived thick and folded, their pages soft from being turned too many times. They were set on the coffee table or carried to the bedroom floor, where children lay on their stomachs with a pen in hand. Certain pages were marked with circles. Others were dog-eared at the corners. Names of toys were copied carefully onto lined notebook paper. Department stores printed entire wish books each year. Dolls posed in miniature living rooms. Model train sets curved across painted landscapes. Board games were shown mid-play, plastic pieces frozen in bright color. The photographs felt staged yet convincing enough to imagine in one's own home. There was no ordering online. If something was wanted, a parent made the trip in person. Stores grew crowded as December advanced. Coats brushed against one another in narrow aisles. Overhead speakers carried instrumental carols that repeated hourly. Sales clerks stood behind glass counters, retrieving boxed items from shelves stacked high. Layaway counters were busy. A small deposit secured a purchase, to be paid off week by week until Christmas. Receipts were folded and tucked into wallets. The final payment felt like a quiet milestone. Children were rarely present for the actual purchase. Gifts appeared later, wrapped in paper pulled from a long roll kept in a closet. The sound of scissors slicing through paper and tape being pulled from its metal dispenser carried through closed doors. On Christmas morning, the catalog images met reality. Some toys looked smaller than expected. Others matched the photograph exactly. Yet the memory of circling them weeks earlier, imagining their weight and sound, remained part of the experience. The catalogs were eventually discarded or saved briefly in a stack. Still, for a few weeks each year, they served as a bridge between imagination and arrival, turned page by page beneath soft lamplight. School slowed down in the days before the break. Desks were pushed slightly out of their straight lines. Construction paper appeared in stacks of red and green. Paste jars with thin brushes were shared between rows. The classroom carried the mixed scent of glue, pencil shavings, and winter coats drying near the radiator. Paper chains were looped and stapled together, stretched across bulletin boards. Cotton batting became snow along the edges of construction paper rooftops. Each child's handwriting formed careful letters spelling out, "Merry Christmas," some uneven, some pressed hard enough to leave marks on the desk beneath. There was usually a small party on the final afternoon. Cupcakes arrived in cardboard boxes. Cookies were arranged on wax paper. Orange drink was poured from a large thermos into paper cups that softened near the rim. The teacher set a record on a portable player. Carols played softly while students exchanged simple cards or small wrapped items. Outside, the playground felt sharper in the cold air. Breath showed in white clouds. Coats were zipped to the chin. The knowledge of 2 weeks at home settled quietly over the day. Before dismissal, homework assignments were written on the board, though they were often light. Chairs were stacked or pushed neatly beneath desks. The classroom was left tidy, decorations still hanging, waiting for January. As children stepped onto buses or into waiting cars, the rhythm shifted. The structure of school paused. Mornings would be slower. Evenings would stretch differently. The season moved from classroom halls to living rooms and kitchens. For many, that final school day marked the true beginning of Christmas. It carried the feeling of release, of something opening ahead, measured not by dates on a calendar but by the steady approach of a single morning circled quietly in the mind. The kitchen carried its own calendar in December. Certain recipes appeared only once a year, written on index cards softened at the corners. Flour settled lightly over the counter. A metal mixing bowl rang faintly against the sink. Butter was left out to soften by the window, wrapped loosely in wax paper. Cookies were made in batches large enough to fill tins. Sugar cookies were rolled thin and cut into shapes with metal cutters that had lost some of their shine. Trees, stars, bells. The dough stuck slightly to the rolling pin, dusted again with flour before the next pass. When they came from the oven, edges were pale gold, centers still soft. Icing was mixed in small bowls, tinted with drops of food coloring. The colors were never exact. Red leaned toward pink. Green varied from bright to muted. Sprinkles were scattered by hand, some landing on the tray instead of the cookie. Other dishes simmered on the stove. Fudge was stirred steadily to prevent burning. Divinity required careful timing, beaten until it lost its gloss. The candy thermometer clipped to the side of the pot was watched closely, numbers rising in slow increments. These were not everyday foods. They were measured and prepared with patience. Children were given small tasks, holding the mixer steady, pressing a fork into peanut butter cookies to leave the crosshatch pattern. As the days passed, plates were assembled for neighbors. Cookies were layered between sheets of wax paper and carried next door in the cold air. A brief exchange at the doorstep. A returned plate a few days later. By Christmas Eve, the kitchen bore quiet evidence of the work. Crumbs in corners. Empty sugar bags folded into the trash. The scent of baked goods lingering long after the oven had cooled. Christmas Eve followed a rhythm that felt both ordinary and expectant. The day moved quietly at first. Last errands were completed in the morning. A grocery bag set down on the kitchen counter. A final roll of tape found in a drawer. Outside, the light faded early, settling into a long winter dusk. By evening, the house was lit softly. The tree lights glowed in the corner. A lamp near the sofa remained on. Wrapping paper was folded away, scissors returned to their place. The living room was restored to order, as if preparing for a guest. In many homes, supper was simple and unhurried. Plates were cleared with less noise than usual. Dishes were washed and stacked to dry. There was a sense of waiting, though no one said so directly. Some families attended a late church service. Coats were buttoned, gloves pulled on. The air outside felt sharp against the face. Inside the church, the pews filled gradually. Programs rustled in quiet hands. At the end, candles were lit one by one, small flames passed carefully along each row until the room held a steady glow. Back at home, children were encouraged toward bed with gentle firmness. Stockings were hung from the mantel or along the stair rail. They were often simple, felt with stitched names, or knit in plain patterns. Once the house grew still, a different kind of work began. Gifts were placed beneath the tree. Tissue paper was arranged loosely in stockings. The sound of footsteps was measured, careful on the hallway floor. Christmas Eve carried a distinct silence. Not empty but full. It settled into the house like a held breath, suspended between what had been prepared and what would arrive with morning light. Christmas morning began early, often before the sun had fully risen. The house was still dark except for the tree lights left on through the night. Their colors reflected faintly against the ceiling. From bedrooms down the hall came the first small sounds, whispers, a door opening, quick footsteps held back at the edge of the living room. There was usually a rule about waiting. Parents were called. Robes were tied. Cameras were lifted from a shelf and readied with a fresh flash cube. Only then did the day begin. Stockings were handled first. They were lifted carefully from the mantel, heavier than the night before. Inside were small, familiar things. Oranges pressed into the toe, candy canes hooked along the edge, chocolate wrapped in foil, perhaps a small toy or pair of socks folded tightly. Then came the gifts beneath the tree. Wrapping paper tore in uneven strips. Boxes were opened on the floor, lids set aside. Instruction booklets slipped out and were unfolded immediately. Batteries were searched for in drawers if they had not been included. There was no rush to move on from one gift to the next. Each item was examined, turned over in the hands, sometimes tested at once. A doll's hair was brushed. A train was set carefully onto its track. A board game lid was lifted to reveal its pieces arranged inside. The room filled gradually with opened boxes and crumpled paper. Someone gathered the torn pieces into a large trash bag between turns. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Bacon might sizzle in a pan. By mid-morning, the first excitement settled into a steady hum. The house felt altered, rearranged by what had been unwrapped. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet, each home holding its own version of the same unfolding scene. By late morning, the household shifted into slower rhythms. Breakfast had been eaten, dishes cleared, the living room still scattered with wrapping paper and open boxes. The smell of pine from the tree mingled with lingering scents of baked goods, coffee, and the faint sweetness of candy canes. Carpets were soft underfoot from stockings that had slipped onto the floor. Children returned repeatedly to their new toys, testing each one in short bursts, then pausing to watch another open a gift. Laughter was quieter now, punctuated by occasional shouts or the rattle of a moving train. Adults moved around more deliberately, straightening chairs, carrying mugs, or quietly observing the small bursts of activity. Windows revealed pale winter light, diffused and still, hinting at the cold beyond. Footsteps were muffled by the snow-covered ground outside. Occasional neighbors appeared at the door, calling greetings or carrying tins of cookies. Brief visits, warm smiles, shared recognition of the day's unfolding, then departure back into the quiet streets. Evening approached slowly. The tree continued to glow in the corner, its colored bulbs reflecting faintly on ornaments already touched and moved during the day. Wrapping paper piles shrank gradually as someone gathered remnants for disposal. A few treasured items were set aside, marked to be remembered. As night fell, the house settled. Children grew tired, yawns stretching between activity. Toys were lined up neatly or left in small clusters where play had paused. Adults dimmed lights, leaving only the tree and a single lamp. A quiet weight hung in the air, not of exhaustion, but of completion. A season's work done, a ritual lived. These days passed slowly yet completely, each moment contained within the soft glow of memory. By the next morning, some traces remained. Most were packed away, but the sense of shared time, ordinary and extraordinary together, lingered in the rooms and in the minds of those who had experienced it, preserved quietly for years to come. As the last lights dimmed and the house grew still, the season left its quiet traces. The tree would be taken down, ornaments wrapped, and boxes returned to their high shelf, but the memory remained. Smells, sounds, and small movements lingered, the hum of bulbs, the feel of wrapping paper, the soft shuffle of footsteps across the floor. These details carried the weight of years, of shared mornings and evenings tucked quietly into family life. For those who remember, the past is never truly gone. It lives in the corners of rooms, in old photographs, and in the quiet warmth of recollection.